When generals called it suicide, he went anyway. And in just 22 minutes, 12 enemy ships were sent to the bottom. It sounds impossible, reckless, even absurd. But on the morning of October 25, 1944, in the waters off Samar in the central Philippines, one American naval officer would defy every rule of survival. This was the largest naval battle in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And as dawn broke over the Philippine Sea, a small group of lightly armed U.S. escort carriers and their screening ships, known as Taffy 3, found themselves face to face with one of the most powerful Japanese surface fleets ever assembled. Battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, including the massive Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. Against this overwhelming force stood a handful of destroyers, and one man who refused to retreat, Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans, captain of the destroyer USS Johnston. His orders were clear: screen the carriers. His situation was hopeless. And yet, what happened next would become one of the most extraordinary naval actions of the Second World War. Please subscribe to our channel as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life. By late October 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached a decisive phase. The United States had begun its invasion of Leyte Island in the Philippines, an operation designed to cut Japan off from its vital oil supplies in Southeast Asia. For the Japanese, losing the Philippines meant strategic collapse, so they launched Operation Shogo, a desperate all-in counterattack. The plan was complex. Multiple fleets would converge on the American invasion force from different directions. One group would act as bait, drawing the powerful U.S. Third Fleet away, while the main striking force, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, would slip through and destroy the vulnerable landing ships in Leyte Gulf. And for a time, it worked. By the early hours of October 25th, Kurita's powerful center force had passed undetected through the San Bernardino Strait. Ahead of them lay only a thin line of American escort carriers and their escorts, Task Unit 77.4.3. Taffy 3. Taffy 3 was never meant to fight a fleet action. Its 6 escort carriers were slow, lightly armored, and designed to support ground troops, not engage battleships. Protecting them were just 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. Among them, USS Johnston, DD 557. A Fletcher-class destroyer, fast, maneuverable, but lightly armored compared to the giants it was about to face. Her captain, Ernest Evans, was a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma, a bold, aggressive officer known for leading from the front. Before the battle, he had told his crew, "This is going to be a fight against overwhelming odds, but we're going to go in, and we're going to do what damage we can." Little did they know just how literal those words would become. At 06:47 hours, lookouts aboard the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay spotted something on the horizon. Pagoda masts, gun flashes. Moments later, towering plumes of water erupted around the carriers as 14-inch and 18-inch shells began to land. It was the Japanese center force. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. The Americans had been completely surprised. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, immediately ordered his carriers to turn east and make smoke, fleeing at maximum speed. But the escort carriers could only manage 17 knots. The Japanese fleet was faster, heavier, and closing rapidly. By 0700 hours, shells were straddling the carriers. Planes were being launched in a frantic effort to strike back. But the real defense would come from the destroyers. USS Johnston, USS Howell, and USS Heermann, along with the smaller destroyer escorts, formed a thin line between the enemy and the vulnerable carriers. And then, without waiting for orders, Evans made his decision. He turned the Johnston directly toward the enemy, full speed ahead. At 0706 hours, Johnston accelerated to flank speed, over 34 knots, charging straight into a vastly superior force. Her mission: attack the heavy cruisers and disrupt their formation. As the distance closed, enemy shells began to fall around her. Massive columns of water erupted on all sides. The deafening roar of naval artillery filled the air. "Open fire!" Johnston's 5-inch guns began firing rapidly, shells arcing toward the nearest Japanese cruiser, Kumano. At the same time, Evans ordered torpedoes prepared. At 0716 hours, range 7,000 yards. Torpedoes, fire! A full spread of 10 torpedoes surged into the water. Moments later, explosions. 1, then 2, then more. Kumano was hit hard, her bow blown off, forcing her out of the fight. Against all odds, Johnston had crippled a heavy cruiser, but the cost was immediate. Within seconds, the Japanese fleet returned fire. Shells slammed into Johnston's hull. A 14-inch shell from a battleship punched through her deck, failing to detonate, but wreaking havoc inside. Other shells followed. The ship shuddered violently. Fires broke out. Steam lines ruptured. Men were thrown across compartments. Yet somehow, Johnston kept moving. By 0730 hours, the situation had become catastrophic. Johnston had taken multiple hits. Her speed was reduced, her steering damaged, her forward guns knocked out. Smoke and fire poured from her decks. Behind her, the escort carriers were under relentless attack. Shells struck the USS Gambier Bay. Aircraft were being launched with half-loaded ordnance, anything to slow the enemy. Pilots flew into the teeth of anti-aircraft fire, strafing ships with machine guns and dropping whatever bombs they had. But it wasn't enough. Johnston, battered and burning, was alone, cut off from the rest of the formation. Most commanders would have withdrawn. Evans did the opposite. He turned back toward the enemy. With only partial power restored, Johnston re-engaged. At 0740 hours, she encountered a group of Japanese destroyers closing in. Despite her damage, Evans ordered an attack. Her remaining guns opened fire. At close range, just 5,000 yards, Johnston engaged in a furious duel. Shells tore through the air. The deck shook with every shot. Evans maneuvered his crippled destroyer into a position where he could launch another torpedo attack, this time against a Japanese battleship group. But his torpedo tubes were empty. He had nothing left, except his guns. Still, he pressed the attack, closing the distance, firing relentlessly. To the Japanese commanders, it was baffling. This lone destroyer, smoking, damaged, outgunned, was charging them again and again. It disrupted their formation, forced them to maneuver, slowed their advance. Time, precious time, was being bought. Behind him, the carriers continued to escape. By 0900 hours, Johnston had taken over a dozen hits. Her engines were failing, her guns were nearly silent. Casualties mounted. The decks were slick with oil and blood, yet the ship still floated. What happened next would become legendary. As Johnston fought on, other ships of Taffy III joined the desperate defense. USS Hole charged into the enemy formation, firing torpedoes before being overwhelmed. USS Heermann engaged multiple cruisers and even fired at the battleship Yamato. Aircraft from the carriers made repeated attacks, some even conducting mock runs when out of ammunition, hoping to intimidate the enemy. The combined effect was staggering. To Admiral Kurita, the situation became increasingly chaotic. Reports came in of heavy resistance, torpedo attacks from multiple directions, airstrikes overhead, smoke obscuring visibility, and, crucially, he believed he might be facing a much larger force than expected. The aggressive actions of ships like Johnston had created the illusion of strength. At 0920 hours, Kurita made a decision. He ordered a general withdrawal. The most powerful Japanese surface fleet in the region turned away. The invasion force at Leyte Gulf was saved, but the cost had been severe. USS Johnston, having fought far beyond her limits, finally succumbed. At approximately 0945 hours, she lost all power. Evans gave the order to abandon ship. As the crew went over the side, the destroyer rolled and sank beneath the waves. Of her crew of 327 men, 186 were lost. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans was among them. He was last seen on the Fantail, wounded, still giving orders. He would not survive. The Battle off Samar remains one of the most extraordinary naval engagements in history. A handful of lightly armed ships, facing overwhelming odds and refusing to yield. In just over 2 hours of fighting, Taffy III had held off a vastly superior force. Japanese losses included multiple damaged cruisers and significant disruption to their fleet. American losses were heavy. 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and a destroyer escort sunk, but the invasion fleet was saved. Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His citation reads, in part, "He gallantly gave his life for his country." His ship, USS Johnston, became a symbol of defiance, of courage against impossible odds, of what determined men can achieve. Even in the face of certain death, when generals called it suicide, he went anyway, and in doing so, he helped change the course of a battle, and perhaps the war itself. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to our channel as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.